Make our hearts attentive to your wisdom and incline us to understanding. We cry out for insight and raise our voices for understanding. Surely, if we seek it like silver and search for it as treasure, we will find the knowledge of God. Amen. Our reading today comes from the first book of Kings, chapter 19, verses 1 through 13. I shuffled the reading a little bit, but it's pretty close to what was suggested. So, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones, and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank, and then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Okay, I have struggled preparing this because this is the longest set of sermon notes I think I've had since I started here, and I'm trying to figure out how best to organize my thoughts because right now they're just kind of splattered against a wall. So I apologize if it ends up being thoughts splattered against a wall. I'm hoping we can draw a pretty picture with them by the end. So, to start, I want to walk through the story. I know we just read it, but I kind of want to walk through the narrative a little bit and rehash some points, and then ask some questions of it a little bit, go into some things I think are very confusing in this, and then I'm going to give some background information that might help us make sense of it before my conclusion. So, I'm hoping this is the right sequence to do this in. All right. Elijah, the main character in our story today, in our collection of little snippets here at least, is a major prophet of the period of Kings, so he doesn't have his own book like Isaiah or Jeremiah. Elijah and then his subsequent follower, Elisha, are both just kind of included here in the books of Kings. And they'd be relatively early on. They'd probably be earlier than most of those books. Elijah is active mostly in the northern kingdom of Israel. So we've talked a lot of times about how the northern kingdom of Israel and then the southern kingdom of Judah didn't get along real well for most of their history. And Elijah is mostly operating out of the north in Israel. Here he's dealing with King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. And functionally, what happens right before this story, the reason that we start with him on the run, is that he got into a bit of a competition with the priests of Baal because there was a drought. And so he challenged them to a competition. Whichever God answered their prayers first, basically, wins. So they set up an altar with a bunch of offerings on it, and he let the priests of Baal go first. And he's like, okay, so they did their prayers and their chants and everything, and nothing happened. And then Elijah goes up and prays, and the altar sets itself ablaze and consumes everything. So he won. And then the crowd, the mob kind of around them, it's slightly unclear who all is included in this, take all of the priests of Baal and kill them, right? So and then it starts to rain shortly thereafter. So that's the setup to this. Ahab, the king, goes back and talks to Jezebel, who seems to be the one primarily employing these priests of Baal, because she's from Canaanite lands to the northwest a little bit. And so she says, you're next, buddy. You killed all of my guys off. I'm going to get rid of you. Oh, so that's the setup to the story. So he runs away, which is sort of reasonable, but seems slightly odd for a prophet that just did what he did. He goes out into the wilderness, lies down under a broom tree, which is what I pictured on the front. So that's what he's sleeping under, is a broom tree. And says, okay, God, just let me die. Which also confuses me, because he seems to have just kind of proved himself. So Jezebel sends a message, doesn't arrest him, right? Sends him a message saying, hey, buddy, in the next day, I'm going to have you killed. Why? Why would you warn him? Why not just arrest him? And then this guy who just won this competition against the priests of Baal and had all of them killed, has all the momentum behind him, right? He runs away and says, okay, God, I guess I can just die. He could have just stayed if he was ready to die. That seemed to have been the plan. So he runs out into the wilderness, and there he takes a nap. And as he's sleeping, the angel comes, hey, you need to eat. So he has a nap and a meal, and then goes back to sleep to take nap number 2, and wakes up to meal number 2, right? Never deny the power of a nap and a good meal, okay? And then he starts walking, okay? At no point does the text give any explanation of why he's traveling to Horeb. It's about 375 miles, I did the math, if he walks in a straight line, and that's probably not possible. But, so that's why it takes 40 days, because, he's going 10 miles a day-ish through the desert to get to Horeb. And he gets there and hops in a cave, which seems reasonable if, you need some kind of shelter there. And the word of the Lord comes to him, which seems to be a separate entity from God. Word comes to him and says, what are you doing here? Did they forget? Did they not notice? He's been walking for a month. Did they lose track? Oh, I forgot, it's this day on the calendar. He's supposed to arrive today. It seems very strange that they even bother asking the question, why are you here? And he responds, oh, things are terrible up in Israel. They've killed all the other prophets. I'm the only one left. Which, once again, you would presume they would already know. And so the angel, the word of the Lord says, hey, just hold on a sec. God's about to walk by. You can talk to him about this. The boss is coming. You might as well bring this up to the next level. So go out on the mountain, the word of the Lord says. Go out and talk to him. And then we hear there's wind that's breaking rocks, and an earthquake and a fire. And then silence.
this is every preacher's favorite part of this reading. They tend to focus just on the God's not in the big storms and the destructive things. God isn't present in these massive, powerful events. He's present in the calm silence. That's a great sermon, but I don't want to cut that piece out because it's part of a story. And what's really fascinating about this to me is it then says he wraps his face and walks out of the cave. So the word of the Lord had told him to go out onto the mountain, and apparently instead of doing that, he just waited in the cave for all of this stuff to happen, and then walks out. But he never gets in trouble for not listening there. And when he walks out before God with his face covered, because if you look at God, you die. That's an old Canaanite tradition that they continue to follow. God turns around and says, "What are you doing here?" Which, once again, I would presume God would know that he was coming and hopefully why. They have a conversation then about how he has to walk all the way back up and anoint 3 people and do all these things. But it's just, maybe it's just me, but this feels like a baffling collection of events, right? That don't make a lot of sense. You can isolate chunks, and they seem sort of internally consistent, right? The story of him having this competition with the other priests makes sense. That's not in our reading today, but if you just hold that up by itself, it sort of makes sense. But Jezebel's reaction, threatening him but not arresting him on the spot, why? Him walking out into the desert and suddenly wanting to die, 2 naps and meals instead of just 1. The Bible's really good at skipping details. I don't know why they felt the need to double up on that one. And then with no explanation, he walks 400 miles to a mountain where he then has to explain himself twice using almost the same words. The whole thing just feels kind of messy and nonsensical. And I think there's a good reason for that, and I think there's a really good lesson we can learn in that, which is the point of 2 pages of notes that I have here. So we need to set this story in a little bit of context, both historical and literary, right? Elijah here, we're looking at somewhere in the 800s-ish BC. So Omri, Ahab is the king, right? Omri, Ahab's father, we know his reign ended somewhere around 840 BC because his enemies, upon defeating him and kicking off his control, made a big monument talking about, we finally beat him after years and years of this jerk being in control. So the Mesha Stele, which was constructed right around 840, is the end of Omri's rule. And so Ahab, so we're looking sort of on this side of 840, so 800-ish. And what's really important about this time period is that this is the start of a process that really that concludes right around the Babylonian captivity in the 600s, or the 500s, I guess, the 6th century. This is the period where Israel and Judah, where these people go from being a group of functionally Canaanites to being a very unique society. Because as far as we can tell archaeologically, here is where we start the process of moving from there being sort of a general recognition of the other Canaanite deities in some way, shape, or form, to their only worshiping the Lord, Adonai, Yahweh. And Elijah might be at the beginning of that. Like, if there are original documents that they are constructing from, Elijah's name literally means, my God is Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton. It has become faux pas to pronounce it, but at the time it doesn't seem to have been. So it's really important to consider the possibility that when Elijah challenges the priests of Baal, they aren't actually brought in from Sidon and Tyre and Carchemish and kind of the other Canaanite territories with Jezebel. It is very possible that there was still common Israelite practices of worshiping these deities, that this wasn't a change from sole worship of the God that they later choose, but in fact a continuation of practices. Because as we excavate these areas, we find more and more references to these other deities, like Asherah. We find in some of the really old temples, the temples that shut down right around the time of the Assyrian conquests, around 700, that there are other temples with holy places in Israel that have multiple stands for deities. So Elijah is very likely not someone trying to bring Israel back into this worship of one sole deity, but is in fact the beginning of the process of transferring them from multiple deities to one. And that is sort of important to consider for time period and story. It's also fantastic. It's also worth remembering Hebrew itself is just a Canaanite language. I mean, Hebrew is the same language as the people that get kind of talked badly about throughout a lot of the Old Testament, the Canaanites. It's just an offshoot. The Hebrew word for God, El, is just the name of the top deity in the Canaanite pantheon, El. And in places where he's referenced as God Most High, El Elyon, right? That is the title of El, the chief Canaanite deity. Words for sacred groves, when they go out and do things at trees, that's Asherah. That's another Canaanite deity. The Passover celebration is a slight change from the festival of Mot, the Canaanite god of death, right? So they are transitioning away from being Canaanites, largely like the rest, to having this independent identity that is very different. And in particular, Baal shows up a lot, right? If you read Old Testament, if you read the stories of Kings and Samuel, part of the interesting thing about why Baal in particular seems to be the focus is that Baal is the Canaanite storm deity, right? So think Thor or Zeus, right? The guy that controls the rain and throws the lightning bolts and does all that stuff. That is Baal. And in the old descriptions of Yahweh, of the Israelite deity, they use the same descriptions. They literally, at one point, one of the psalms is a Canaanite psalm to Baal, where they just cross out his name and put in Adonai, right? Because they occupy the same place theologically, so they are competing for the same domain, right, of control originally, before they kind of lump all of the various domains into one. All right. That is the sort of historical setting for this event that, however it may have actually happened. But that event is taking place in the 800s-ish, right? This book, 1 Kings, as we have 2 Kings, Chronicles, most of the Old Testament, as we have it, is put together in the form we have it now during the Babylonian exile, or right around that period. All of the priests and everything that get marched off from the temple in Jerusalem before it's destroyed bring with all their texts. And they have two real goals in having all of those texts with them. One is to preserve them, to make sure they don't lose these sacred traditions and texts and ideals and laws and all of the things that they had before going into exile. And the second part is to make sure that their people that are with them, who after a few years, when Persia destroys the Babylonian exile and lets them go free, they have those texts maintained so that they can use them to redevelop an identity for their people. They've been in exile for decades, for literal generations at this point. They are going back to their homeland, and the people that had preserved this and transmitted it and carefully copied it need to take that to help reestablish themselves as a people and to answer the essential questions of that identity. Why were we taken? Why are we going back, and what do we do going forward? So they did the two things at the same time. They take their little fragment stories, they take the pieces of text that they have, and they compile them together into larger sheets. So instead of having a giant stack of small stories and bits, they have a stack of organized and ordered stories and components of law that can be more easily copied and transmitted and studied, and that create a story that they can work with, that put all of the that fit all of the puzzle pieces together into a narrative for them to share with the people, for them to use to rebuild who they are. Now, that means we get lots of weird places all throughout the Old Testament where the pieces don't exactly fit, right? And we've talked about this a lot. We have two creation narratives, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and they don't quite line up because they're compiling together multiple sources. If you go into the Noah's flood narrative, there's a whole point where it'll say only 2 of this, and then suddenly it'll say actually 7 of this. And then it'll say this happened, and then it'll say the exact same thing happened again, because they're trying not to lose stuff, right? So as they're copying it together, you get these weird reduplications of almost the same thing because they have multiple versions of basically the same story, and they don't want to lose it. So when we get stuff in here that seems to be the same thing but happening multiple times, it's really easy to look at it and say, they had 2 different versions of this, right? And they're trying not to lose anything, so they're just lining them up. So he gets woken up twice to eat. One of those versions of the story might have had an explanation of why he's going to Horeb, but somehow that got lost along the way. Maybe the document was damaged, maybe they couldn't fit it in to make, who knows, right? He gets asked the same question twice in a row by actors who definitely should already know the answer. Why? Well, because the question was being asked in the text that they had, so they had to line it up in a way that made a story, that fit it together in a way that sort of made sense. But you get these weird reduplications, right? And they're doing this with stories that are 200 years old at this point, all right? If this is happening in between 840 and 800 BCE, okay, the end of exile is the 500s. So we're talking between 200 and 300 years where a barely literate populace is passing along some of these stories, probably as oral tradition for a long time, and then writing them down in pieces in the northern kingdom, which gets conquered by Assyria, and the priests of the northern kingdom have to drag everything they can down to Jerusalem, right? So all they have are these pieces that they're trying to fit together into a story. And sometimes that story doesn't make sense. And that's okay. I'm not trying to judge it harshly and saying it's not meaningful or important or that it's nonsense that we should ignore. I'm just saying it's important we understand how we get to what we have in front of us, so then we know, right, what that text is, so that we know when we're looking at it what we also are doing with it. And here's where I think there's a really important lesson in the incredibly messy process that is 6th century scribes trying to put together late 9th century fragments of stories into something that answers their questions and gives them an identity and a goal going forward, a purpose, right? Because this was meant for that. It was not a record of history in any kind of objective sense. They did not have a concept of that. They had a concept of purpose. That these are carefully crafted for the purpose of generating ideas. These didn't pop into existence, right? The Bible did not fall out of the sky onto somebody's head as we have it. It is all crafted. It is all created by people. It is a conversation over centuries upon centuries of people equally as dedicated to the importance of these stories, trying to further the story into the future, which is what we're still doing now, right? And so, even though we're not adding to it, we are still trying to make sense of it. These are now our fragments, right, that we are putting together as best we can to create a narrative around which we develop an identity and a sense of purpose going forward, a mission, an idea. Elijah doesn't always make sense because he's a character in the story that serves this purpose. Now, that also means that just like they did, we get to play around with the fragments. Because everyone in this book does. There is this idea that somehow it is exactly as it should be, but we all put it together that way, right? You read early church fathers and their willingness to grab some random chunk of text and haul it out of everything that it's saying around it and line it up with some other stuff that says the same thing and say, this is now our doctrine, right? They are looking at this text and putting it together to make sense of the narrative, to participate in the conversation about who God is and what God is calling us to do. And that leaves us with an important mission, an important process, an important moment of reflection that we have to ask ourselves. What do we choose to focus on? Right? What do we center and what do we put on the side? Because you can find anything you want in here. All right? What you choose to highlight, what you choose to focus on, what you choose to be the core of your understanding of faith is a reflection of who you are, more than it is a reflection of either God or the Bible. Because ultimately, we are invited on this journey, and as much as I truly believe there is a light at the end of that tunnel, there is something we are being led into through the process of this text, people stop along the way, all the time. Elijah could have stopped under that broom tree and said, nah, I'll just die, which he seemed to have been willing to do. But he didn't. So there are Christians out there that look at stories like the stories of Elijah and this kind of period where the message seems to be very much we cannot allow any divergence from this exact tradition, so these other priests, they need to be killed or kicked out. And we need to ensure that everyone exactly follows our doctrine on all points or face consequences. You can make the Bible say that really easily. Read through this chunk, because it's really easy to get that message out of this, if that's all you want to center and that's all you want to look at. Alternatively, you can jump to something like Jesus in the New Testament that seems to be saying instead, the trouble in the world is largely a result of people hoarding wealth and power and refusing to care for their neighbor. And instead, what God calls us to do is to try and break that cycle, to try and break out of that ideology, and instead be self-sacrificial servants for our neighbors to make the world a better place. You can get that out of it too. So what part you choose to focus on, where along that journey you choose to stop, is a reflection of you. There's a guy, he is a comedian, but comedians sometimes say really, really profound things. Never write off comedy as just being kind of meaningless entertainment, because comedians will at times say very profound things. There's a comedian that I really enjoy. His name is Brennan Lee Mulligan, And he has a line that he's saying in an interview at one point. I don't even remember what the interview was about. But he's talking to the interviewer, and he says, look, when it comes to both, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's pretty, I'm trying to be as close as I can. He says, when it comes to both individuals and societies and organizations, personality predates ideology. So before you were an authoritarian or a fascist, you were a bully and a jerk, right? That who you are as a person, that you choose the ideology based on who you are as a person at any given point, right? That most of us, most human beings, will find ideals that suit what they already believe rather than being willing to question what they already think and who they are and try to grow into something better. Most people just pick something that tells them that wherever they're at, whatever they are at that moment, that's the best, and they're right. That's where most people stop, when someone tells them that they are right. You can do that with this too. Because if you think you already know what this says and what you're going to get out of it, you can find the things in here that back you up on that and believe you're right. And comfort you in knowing that you are exactly the way you should be and that everybody else who disagrees is wrong. You can do that. People do. We all know them. Or you can imagine that this is inviting you into more. That this is inviting you to reconsider something. That maybe you are not the ultimate arbiter of what is right in the universe, and instead it's worth questioning things, including yourself, and asking what would actually be a better world to live in. One where we're like this, or one where we're like that guy. So, when you read this, when you think about this, remember who you are in that process. Because who you are has likely had a lot to say of what you think about this and what you think about this. And ask yourself, very seriously, where am I at on this journey? What am I choosing to center? And is that really what I am being invited into? What I am being asked to look like? What I say I want to be? Because you are not, you too, like those that got to put this together, get to look at the pieces and decide how you want to sequence them. How you make sense out of this story. They did. They weren't ashamed of that. The New Testament authors, they played real fast and loose with some of the Old Testament. We've gone into that time and time again. That's fine, because it was okay for them to do that, and they did. So do we. We are just as much inheritors of this as they were. So, really consider who you are, who you want to be, and where you are at on that journey. And how this can inspire you to keep moving. To think of something new. To create something new. Sing a new song unto the Lord. Amen.